Colleague from Virginia. I'm a co-sponsor of his amendment. I think it's a very noble attempt to try to put better hands on the stimulus. It's interesting to note that when we had the first hearing with the IG that's overseeing the stimulus, that he said regrettably $50 billion would be wasted. $50 billion out of 867, actually 940 some now, $1 billion was going to be wasted. So we started with the assumption that about 6 or 7% of this money is going to be defrauded. And I would just congratulate my colleague because some of the steps that he's talking about in his amendment will actually lessen that, hopefully. And I agree with him. It's exciting for me to see a bipartisan attempt to start bringing teeth into the laws that we pass, not towards the American public, but towards the agencies that administer the funds. And I congratulate him. I think he's got a good amendment, and I think we'll have a great vote on it. I wanted to spend a few minutes talking about the bill that we're considering. Yesterday afternoon, I had the great fortune. My daughter was performing in Florida and was driving back to New York, and I got to see my 7-month-old granddaughter. And anybody that's a grandparent knows what it's like to see your grandchildren. It's just, there's nothing wrong with it and everything right with it. You get a picture and see in your grandchildren aspects of your children. It draws back memories. But I was struck by that encounter with my daughter and granddaughter, and by the way, her dog. What are our hopes and dreams about? What are the hopes and dreams that we have for our children and our grandchildren? And our hopes and dreams are that they will have great opportunity to flower and blossom in a way that they can take advantage of their God-given talents and their hard work and become a success in their life's endeavors. And when you contrast that with the heritage of our nation, a heritage which is about sacrifice, where one generation makes hard choices, makes difficult decisions, they sacrifice of their own benefits from their own endeavors to create opportunity so that the next generation of Americans can have that opportunity to fulfill and expand their heart's desires. We heard the senator from Utah today talk about where the problems were with our nation, and he talked about where all the gold was in terms of fixing what's wrong. I would have to say I would disagree with him. When I look at the U.S. Constitution, and then I look at all the government programs that the federal government has fostered, passed, and funds, I see a black and white slate. I see on the one hand the very limited intent of our founders that was spelled out very clearly in Article 1, Section 8 of the enumerated powers. Here are the powers you're to have. We are designing you to be a limited federal government, and we're going to reserve everything else to the people and the states, i.e. through the 10th Amendment. But those words are actually in there. What is not spelled out for the U.S. federal government is explicitly reserved for the people and their states. And so when we consider the mess we're in, the fact that we had a $1.56 trillion deficit last year, that 43 cents of every penny that we spent, every dollar that we spent, we borrowed from our grandchildren, that this year it's going to be 1.8 trillion, that over the next 9 years we're going to spend $10 trillion that we don't have, and I would put forward most of it on things that we don't need. And especially if you look at it in the light of what our constitutional charge is. And I've made this statement from the floor several times, but the oath we take, when I was sworn in January of 2005, the oath I took was to uphold the Constitution. And the Constitution is our guideline, our direction for what is our responsibility and what should be left to the states. So when I hear my colleague, and I agree with him, that unless we reform entitlements, we're going to have a difficult time solving our problems. But there is another answer. Actually, there's two other answers. One of the other answers is to go through with a fine-tooth comb and look at every federal government program and say, is it really a legitimate responsibility of the federal government? And if it is it a program that we need? You know, in 2 weeks, my staff found 640 duplicative programs in the federal government across all agencies that all do the same thing. 105 programs to encourage students to go into technology, math, engineering, and science. 105 different programs. So as we look at comparing what is our obligation and what is our charge under the Constitution with what's really happening, all of a sudden a wide world opens up of monies that we don't have to spend, that aren't absolutely necessary, that aren't absolutely a priority, that we shouldn't be spending in a time when we're borrowing and stealing the future of my little granddaughter, Katie Rose, and everybody else's granddaughter. Why would we not demand that we do the hard work of going through what is truly our obligations and eliminating what is not, and eliminating the multitude of duplications that the federal government has? And ask ourselves, why shouldn't we be put to the same test that every other family in America is put to? You know, once you max your credit card out, once you're past your limits, they don't continue to extend you money. Unfortunately, what they do is they jack up your interest rate. Well, guess what's getting ready to happen to us? We do not have an unlimited credit card. And what's going to happen to us over the next few years, you're seeing 30-year bond obligations today going at a higher percentage than what they've ever gone for in the last 4 or 5 years. And you're going to see that trend combining. And out of the $10 trillion that we're going to spend that we don't have in the next 9 years, $5.6 trillion of that is to pay interest on the national debt. So what we're going to do is we find ourselves, what that person that's maxed out their credit card is, now we're paying interest on the interest instead of paying off the debt. I said there were two ways of looking at it. The second is to go through the federal government and eliminate the waste, fraud, abuse, and duplication. One is to eliminate where we don't truly have the responsibility nor authority for what we're doing under the Constitution. But the second is we have identified $350 billion a year of waste, fraud, and duplication in the federal government. We've done that over a period of hearings over the past 4 years. One amendment out of about 800 that I've offered over the last 5 years has been accepted to eliminate some of that. Just one. They've all otherwise been voted down. They've been voted down because members of this body refuse to make the hard choices about priorities because they think we don't have to. Well, the gig's up. The American people, there's a rumble, a real rumble in America about holding us to be accountable for the future of this country, which means no longer ignoring the hard choices, no longer adding to the credit card. And I say all that to talk about the bill that's before us. We have a bill before us that is called the tax extender bill. But that's not what it is. It's the debt extender bill. Because this bill, in light of all the speeches you're going to hear in this body, and all the excuses and all the press releases that are going to be released, is going to add $104 billion to our children's credit card. And this body, yesterday, voted to go forward with that. They voted to not make the hard choices, not offset the spending. If these are priority items that we should be doing in this bill, then why aren't we going after some of the waste, fraud, and abuse in the federal government to get rid of it? That's $104 billion over the next 10 years, just with this one bill alone, that we're going to add to the debt. Now, that comes down to $10.4 billion a year, and we got $350 billion worth of waste. And yet we refuse to go into that $350 billion worth of waste, fraud, and duplication and eliminate anything to pay for this. Instead, we're going to steal that opportunity. We're going to steal that future. We're going to put a blight on the blossom of opportunity for our children and grandchildren. I beg America to hold us accountable, to not accept business as usual anymore. When you get down and start talking about what this means, when you take the $104 billion and divide it by the 300 million people in this country and then multiply it by the average family size, what you get is the $1,282 per family that this one bill's going to add. So if, in fact, you go to sleep day after tomorrow when this bill has passed the Senate and 60 senators vote for it to go, and we go on and do it, 35 or 36 will vote against it. But the 64 or 65, when you go to put your head on the pillow at night, you can thank them for jeopardizing the future of your children. Not because what they want to do in the bill is necessarily wrong, but because they lack the courage to stand up and make the hard choices that are required in times of distress in our country. And if you study our history, our greatest leaders exhibited courage in the face of adversity. And they pulled us through by making hard choices, not running away from the hard choices. We've had a lot of people critical of Senator Bunning because he raised the issue on a $12 billion jobs bill that isn't going to do anything and said we ought to pay for it. And we voted him down. We said no. But you know what? As I read the American public, about 80% of them said we should have paid for it. We should have done it. And those people who were most critical of Senator Bunning on the floor are people who've hardly ever voted against any spending bill in their entire career in the Senate. Because they honestly believe it's okay to mortgage the future of your children to benefit your own political career. So what we have developing in the Senate isn't partisanship. It is policy differences that will make the difference for this country. And if the ne'er-do-wells of doing it the same old way win, our children don't have a future. What they have is a debt burden that we will never get out of. And we hear speeches like the senator from Utah that tend to push us and think, well, we've got to go and figure out how we fix Medicare and Social Security. Well, how do we fix Medicare and Social Security? We got to delay retirement, lessen benefits, eliminate fraud in Medicare, delay eligibility. Those are the only answers. Or raise taxes. How do you raise taxes on the American people when you know you're spending $350 billion a year that's wasted? How do you in good conscience even consider that? I'm not against having a tax increase when and if we've done everything we can do to get this government efficient, eliminate what is not our role, and get rid of the fraud, waste, and duplication. And most of America wouldn't be against that either. But right now, they don't trust us, and for a good reason, they do not trust this body. Because we're not shooting straight with them. We're not telling them that we're going to add $1,200 to their kids' debt. And when you really take this number, this $347 number, and you look at kids 25 years and younger, and go out 20 years, here's what you find. is not only are they going to be responsible for the debt we have today, plus the $78 trillion of unfunded liabilities for Medicare, Medicaid, Social Security, and all the other trust funds, including federal employee retirement, which adds up to $1,300,000 for every person in this country under 25. Now ask yourself how in the world they will ever own a home, send their kids to college, if in fact they're having to support $60,000 a year in interest on a debt that they didn't create. The promise of America was freedom. Debt is a hard taskmaster, but it's doubly hard when it wasn't your debt, when it's your parents' and your grandparents' debt. And yet your task with changing your lifestyle, your opportunities, your hope and vision for your children, because we didn't have the courage to stand up and say enough is enough. When will it ever be enough? When we can't sell our bonds? When will it ever be okay to offend those that are on the dole who don't deserve to be on the dole? When will it be okay to eliminate the waste in the federal government? Not at a time we're going to have a $1.8 trillion deficit. Not at a time when $50 billion is going to be defrauded out of the stimulus program. When will we ever do it? We've never been in the financial situation that our country's in today. Never before in our history. Our whole foreign policy is now being affected and impacted because of our debt. We have to keep an ear towards China as we conduct our foreign policy in the fear that they may dump our bonds. Why would we put ourselves in that position when we don't have to? Because there's no spine in the U.S. Senate. There's no spine in the U.S. Congress. There's no spine to go out and say, yes, I made the hard choices, you may not like it, but your children deserve that we make hard choices and difficult decisions, and if I'm not here, it's okay, I did the right thing. I secured our future. I will be able to sleep at night knowing that I was not a part of taking and stealing that blossom of potential from our children and grandchildren. I'll finish up, Mr. President, by asking a question of the American people. Is it right that you have to make choices within a finite budget, but yet your elected leadership in Washington doesn't? Is it fair for you to have to sacrifice to create a future for your children when we're destroying that future in Washington? It is a time for Americans who've never been involved in the political arena before in our nation to get involved. Because your children and your children's children, future, depends on it. And we have a very short window with which to recapture the potential of an economic renaissance in our country, and it's less than 4 years. If you look at what we're coming to in terms of debt to GDP and in terms of the size of the government to the size of the GDP, we will be on an irreversible course that will eliminate American exceptionalism forever. Because the thing that made us free and kept us free was a fairly limited federal government. And what we have in front of us is an attempt not to get it back down to a size that's manageable and within the intent of our founders' vision and American people's expectation. We have an intent to grow it. The discretionary budget of the federal government on the rate that has been passed by this body the last 2 years alone, not counting the stimulus, will cause the federal government to double in size in 5 years. We're 40% bigger than we were 2 years ago. Actually, it's 38.6%. Bigger. And we hear that the average federal employee now makes $72,000 and the average private employee now makes $40,000. And that we've added 170,000 new jobs in the government in the last 7 months, while we've lost 3 times that in the private sector. Things are out of whack. And the only way they're going to change is if the American public demands it to be changed. So I'll go back. This isn't a tax extenders bill. This is a debt extension bill. We're going to extend another $104 billion of debt across the threshold of opportunity for our children and grandchildren. I'm not going to be a part of that. I'm not going to be complicit in it. And if that's not satisfactory with the people of Oklahoma, I'm fine with that. I'm ready to make the hard choices to make us a lean, mean fighting machine again as an economy, a lean, mean fighting machine as far as opportunity. And the way to do that is to downsize the federal government, put it back within the roles of its intended purposes, and return to the states both the money and the authority to handle what is rightfully theirs in the first place. And the second thing that's important is to get rid of the $350 billion worth of waste, fraud, abuse, and duplication that occurs every year that we will do nothing about. We do nothing about it. We send out press releases, but when it comes time to vote to make a hard choice, we don't do it. We refuse to do it. We refuse to offend those that are well-connected and well-heeled while we send our country into the trash heap of history through financial collapse. My hope is that my colleagues will stand up and say, we're not going to pass this debt extender bill till you pay for it. Till you make the hard choices about what's waste, what's duplication, what's fraud, and get rid of some of that to pay if these are really priority items. You see, if they're really priority, if America really needs them, then there's got to be something that's a lower priority that we can take away. But we don't have that kind of thought in the Senate because we just keep putting the credit card into the machine. Thank you, China. Thank you, China. Thank you, China. And it's not going to be too long where we'll be saying, may we please, China? May we please? May we? Watch what's happening to Greece. Look at the articles on Ireland today, the hard choices they had to make to get themselves out of trouble. But they're doing it. We're ignoring it in this body, and we're going to pass another $104 billion along to our children and grandchildren. Mr. President, I would yield the floor and note the absence of a quorum.
Clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Akaka.